The fluorescent glow, stark and unblinking, spilled down from the vast ceiling, painting the deserted concourses in a sickly, uniform pallor. I stood amidst the hushed expanse of the shopping mall after closing with lights still on, the air thick with the faint, lingering ghosts of commerce, a whisper of synthetic vanilla from a defunct candle shop, the faint, metallic tang of an escalator long since stilled, the sterile scent of floor cleaner clinging to the polished tiles. My footsteps echoed, sharp and singular, against the cavernous silence, a sound utterly alien to my usual sanctuaries of hushed libraries and parchment-scented archives. My world, typically, was one of precision, the delicate tracing of an ancient coastline, the painstaking verification of a forgotten trade route, the subtle shift in a territorial boundary meticulously rendered in sepia ink. I, Reid, a historical cartographer, found solace in the absolute certainty of lines and legends, in the irrefutable truth etched onto vellum. This place, however, was a monument to impermanence, a decaying husk of transient desires, and I was here only out of necessity. A distant relative, a name I barely recognized from the brittle branches of our sprawling family tree, had passed, leaving me the unexpected burden of an ancestral estate. Remote, decaying, and shrouded in a quiet notoriety I hadn't yet fully grasped, it had necessitated the temporary storage of its contents within a vacant retail unit here, a holding pen for a lifetime of forgotten things. The estate lawyer, a harried man who spoke in clipped, efficient phrases, had granted me access after hours, citing security and a desire for uninterrupted inventory. Now, in the spectral glow of this architectural tomb, I was sifting through the final boxes, searching for any documents that might shed light on the estate's peculiar history. Perhaps, simply a deed. Each item, wrapped in yellowed newspaper or swaddled in moth-eaten blankets, felt heavy with the weight of time, a silent testament to lives lived and forgotten. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth glide of antique paper, worked with methodical patience, untying twine, prying open latches, disturbing the settled dust of decades. I found tarnished silver, brittle lace, a collection of unmarked journals filled with an indecipherable script. Nothing, however, captured the meticulous eye of the cartographer within me until I reached a trunk tucked away in the furthest, dimmest corner. No lock, no inscription, just a simple, stiff latch. With a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the vast emptiness of the mall, it yielded. Inside, beneath layers of faded linens and a scattering of dried, unidentifiable botanicals, lay a rolled object, wrapped in a sheet of oilskin. My fingers, accustomed to the textures of antiquity, felt the faint, almost imperceptible give of aged parchment beneath the protective covering. I unrolled it carefully on the dusty floor, the oilskin crackling like dry leaves. It was a map. Not just any map, but a map of the estate itself, rendered with an astonishing, almost obsessive, degree of detail. My breath hitched. The craftsmanship was undeniable, exquisite. Every contour of the land, every ancient oak, every winding path was delineated with a draftsman's precision. I recognized the familiar, if exaggerated, curve of the old river, the slight rise of the eastern ridge, the approximate location of the manor house itself, though rendered in a style that felt older, more severe than any architectural drawing I'd ever seen. The ink, a deep, earthy brown, had bled subtly into the parchment in places, giving the lines a living, organic quality, like veins beneath skin. But it was incomplete. Vast sections, particularly towards the estate's southern boundaries, were left blank, pristine swaths of untouched parchment. My eyes, trained to discern the subtlest anomalies, gravitated to the symbols. They were not the standard notations of my profession, no compass roses, no scale bars, no conventional legends. Instead, scattered across the depicted landscape, were archaic markings, intricate and unsettling. They seemed to pulse with a silent, malevolent energy under the unforgiving artificial light. One symbol, a series of concentric circles intersected by jagged lines, repeated itself with unnerving frequency around the estate's lowest, most secluded points. This wasn't merely an incomplete historical document, it felt like a riddle, a coded message veiled in topographical precision. My professional curiosity, a sharp, insistent hunger for understanding, was instantly ignited. The map felt less like a record of the land and more like a blueprint for something hidden, something ancient and deeply unsettling. The steady hum of the unseen ventilation system seemed to deepen, a low, guttural vibration. I traced a finger along one of the strange symbols, the parchment cool and dry beneath my touch. I had to finish it. The old map, rolled tight within its leather confines, hummed with a silent demand, its parchment edges already frayed by the currents of my thoughts. I yearned for the bite of real air, the honest scent of earth, even if that earth was ancient and shadowed. The drive was a slow unraveling from the grid-like precision of urban planning. Asphalt gave way to gravel, streetlights to the spectral gleam of the moon, a pale coin tossed into a velvet sky. The trees grew taller, their branches knitting into a dense, impenetrable canopy that swallowed the road whole. Each mile deepened the sense of removal, of venturing beyond the charted, the known. The estate, when it finally loomed into view, was less a destination and more a destination's skeletal remains. The house itself, a hulking silhouette against the faint pre-dawn sky, wore its decay like a shroud. Broken window panes gaped like sightless eyes, and vines, thick as old ropes, clawed at the stone facade. But it was not the house that drew me first. It was the land, a sprawling, untamed wilderness that stretched beyond the skeletal sentinel of the manor. The incomplete map lay open on the kitchen table the next morning, its vellum skin a pale counterpoint to the rough-hewn wood. My fingers, stained with ink from countless hours spent over other, less demanding cartographies, traced its delicate lines. This was not a map of roads or rivers, but of subtle elevations, of ancient trees marked with cryptic symbols, of suggested paths that vanished into shaded blanks. Armed with compass, measuring tape, and the unsettling map, I began my reconciliation. The air, initially crisp, carried a scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like old blood or wet rust. The task was simple in theory. Verify the existing landscape against the ancestral drawing, fill in the blanks. But the land itself seemed to resist, to shift subtly beneath my gaze. The first discrepancy was minor, a clump of overgrown hawthorn where the modern property deeds indicated only open field. Yet, the old map suggested a boundary, a faint, dotted line snaking through that very spot. Pushing through the thorny thicket, my boots scuffed against something solid. Beneath a century of fallen leaves and matted roots, I unearthed a low, lichen-covered stone wall, its blocks expertly fitted, now almost entirely consumed by the earth. It was a ruin, a forgotten skeletal finger pointing to a past unrecorded in any public record, yet hinted at by the delicate ink of the inherited map. A prickle of unease began its slow crawl up my spine. It was as if the light itself recoiled, unable to penetrate the gloom. My breath plumed faintly, a ghost in the sunlit air. Deeper into the estate, beyond the formal gardens that had long since surrendered to the wild, I discovered them, the stone markers. They were not grave markers, nor boundary stones in any conventional sense. These were rough-hewn monoliths, some barely chest-high, others half-buried, their surfaces eroded by centuries of wind and rain. They were arranged in an irregular, almost haphazard pattern, yet their placement felt deliberate, imbued with a forgotten purpose. My modern surveying equipment struggled to make sense of their alignment, their positions resisting any geometric interpretation I could impose. The old map, however, depicted them with stark, unadorned crosses, clustered in this exact configuration, as if acknowledging their peculiar significance without deigning to explain it. As I knelt beside one particularly ancient stone, its surface rough beneath my gloved fingers, a sound reached me. It was not the rustle of leaves or the call of a bird. It was a low, resonant thrumming, faint but persistent, seeming to emanate from deep within the earth itself. It vibrated through the very ground I knelt upon, a slow, rhythmic pulse that unsettled the stillness. My rational mind strained to attribute it to a distant generator, a hidden pump, anything mechanical. But the estate was too remote, too isolated for such a source. The sound had an organic quality, a deep, almost guttural hum, as if the land itself were breathing. The determined cartographer in me wanted to complete the picture, to fill in every blank. The estate was not merely decaying, it was active, and the map was not merely a guide, but an invitation to something ancient and malevolent stirring beneath my feet. The metallic chill that settled deep in the bones. The journey back was a descent into deepening gloom. The artificial luminescence of the city dissolved into the inky embrace of the countryside. The house, when it finally loomed into view, was a silhouette against a starless canvas, a jagged scar on the horizon. Its windows, like vacant eyes, seemed to watch my approach. Inside, the silence was absolute, a living thing that pressed against the eardrums. I moved through the ancestral halls, the rhythmic creak of floorboards beneath my boots the only sound, a counterpoint to the thrumming quiet. It was then, in the periphery of my vision, that I first saw it. A flicker, quick as a moth's wing, darting from behind a velvet curtain, gone before my gaze could properly fix upon it. Nothing. Just the settling dust, the sigh of the old house. Fatigue, I reasoned, the late hour, the stress of the inheritance. My mind playing tricks. The next morning, the rationalizations felt less convincing. I found the antique silver letter opener, which I had left beside the inkwell on my desk, now resting atop a stack of maps I'd been organizing, its polished surface reflecting the faint morning light in a way that seemed almost deliberate. A small thing, easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, yet a prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. Later, a heavy brass bookend shifted from its place, leaning precariously against a stack of volumes on a distant shelf. Again, I blamed myself, my own clumsy movements in the dim light of the previous night. Faint, ethereal currents of sound, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, or the rustle of ancient parchment. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, a low, indistinct murmur that would swell and recede, just beyond the threshold of comprehension. It was like being teased by a half-forgotten dream, a melody just out of reach. I began to attribute them to the old house's settling, the wind finding its way through unseen cracks, the groaning of aged timbers. Yet, the distinct impression of voices, hushed and conspiratorial, persisted. Sleep offered no respite. My nights became a succession of vivid, unsettling nightmares. One overcast afternoon, the light in my study a bruised gray, I returned to the ancestral map. Its parchment, aged and brittle, lay spread across the vast mahogany table, a testament to generations of land and lore. I traced a finger along the familiar lines, the carefully delineated boundaries, the elegant script marking forgotten landmarks. My eyes drifted to a section I had meticulously studied for days, a blank, unlabeled expanse near the estate's western boundary, nestled close to the ancient, overgrown well. I remembered it as an empty space, a curious omission in an otherwise obsessively detailed document. But now, it was not entirely blank. Delicate, almost translucent lines, too fine to be ink, too precise to be a stain, had begun to coalesce. It was a crude, jagged glyph, resembling a fractured eye, or perhaps a tooth, staring up from the parchment with an unnerving intensity. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat, the scent of dust and ancient paper suddenly sharp and metallic. The map, the very object of my meticulous study, had changed. It was no longer a static record, it was a living skin, revealing its secrets, or perhaps, its demands. The rational part of me, the cartographer, tried to dissect it, to find an explanation. A trick of the light? A previously overlooked watermark? The estate was not merely decaying, it was waking, and it was reaching out to me through the very artifact I sought to master. I had driven back to the estate under a sky the color of bruised plums, the distant city lights receding in my rearview mirror like a fading memory. The silence of the ancestral home, when I finally returned, was not a comfort but a profound, resonant hum, pregnant with unspoken history. The map, with its unsettlingly precise lines and cryptic symbols, lay spread across the great oak table in the library, a silent accusation. My hands, still trembling faintly from the inexplicable chill that had permeated the deserted mall, traced its contours, each marking now a burning question. I needed to delve deeper, beyond the land itself. The library, a cavernous room usually left undisturbed, became my sanctuary and my prison. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the tall, grimy windows, each particle a tiny, forgotten ghost. The scent of decaying leather and brittle paper filled my lungs, a potent perfume of antiquity. Bookshelves, stacked to the ceiling, sagged under the weight of generations, their spines cracked, their titles faded into illegibility. This was where the answers lay, buried beneath layers of time and neglect. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. My fingers grew stained with the grime of ages, my eyes gritty from poring over handwritten script. I pulled down heavy tomes, their pages crumbling at the slightest touch, their contents largely irrelevant. The script, spindly and agitated in the earlier entries, grew increasingly erratic, almost frantic, in the later ones. They belonged to a distant forebear, an estate manager from the late 18th century, and a great-aunt who had lived here in the early 1900s. The initial entries in the estate manager's journal spoke of mundane agricultural concerns, crop yields, and tenant disputes. But slowly, subtly, a different narrative began to emerge. He meticulously recorded instances of livestock disappearing without a trace, and then, more disturbingly, the vanishing of a young stable hand, a local farmer, and finally, a visiting surveyor. One letter read, the ink bleeding slightly as if the writer's hand had trembled. My dear, the house breathes with a malignity that grows stronger with each passing season. My brother, your great-uncle, speaks now to the trees. He sees faces in the patterns of the moss, hears voices carried on the wind that are not of this world. He paces the property, drawn always to the old well, muttering about the hunger beneath the earth. The family friend's replies grew increasingly desperate, urging her to leave, to abandon the estate before it consumed her too. There was a desperate plea for her to recount the local folklore he had mentioned, the old tales of the lineage and its burden, but her subsequent letters grew vague, then ceased altogether. My breath hitched in my throat.
The pattern was undeniable, a macabre tapestry woven through generations.
Madness, disappearances, and a pervasive, insidious influence emanating from the very ground. The locations mentioned in the journals and letters corresponded precisely with the unusual markings on my inherited map, the clusters of ancient stones, the forgotten dell, the well. It wasn't merely the draft from a cracked window pane. It felt deliberate. The air thickened, pressing in on me, and I felt an inexplicable urge to look over my shoulder, though I knew I was alone. This map, I realized with a sickening lurch in my gut, wasn't just a guide to the estate's physical layout. It was a key. A key to a history far more sinister than I could have imagined, a blueprint of sacrifice and madness, a guide to something malevolent buried deep within the land, waiting. And by attempting to complete it, by tracing its lines and seeking its secrets, I wasn't just unearthing history, I was awakening it. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered with a terrifying, obsessive heat. I had opened a door, and I had no idea what monstrous thing waited on the other side. It was a lingering phantom, a chill that had ridden shotgun with me all the way back to the estate, settling into the very marrow of the house. I had driven back under a sky the color of bruised plums, the distant city lights receding in my rearview mirror like a fading fever dream, leaving me to the encroaching, absolute dark of the countryside. I tried to lose myself in the familiar ritual of mapmaking, spreading the ancient parchment across the heavy oak table. My hand, usually steady and precise, trembled as I reached for my instruments. The inkwell, a small porcelain dish, seemed to shimmer with an unnatural sheen. Then it began. Not a sound, not a touch, but a flicker at the periphery of my vision. I blinked, turning sharply, but there was nothing. Only the familiar, ornate wallpaper, its patterns now seeming to writhe in the dim light. A trick of tired eyes, I told myself, a mind overwrought. But the feeling persisted, a prickle beneath my scalp, the sense of being observed by something unseen, unblinking. I picked up a magnifying glass, intending to scrutinize a particularly cryptic symbol on the map. As I brought it close, the glass seemed to ripple, and for a terrifying instant, the intricate lines of the estate transformed. Within its depths, a single, glowing eye, ancient and malevolent, pulsed with a sickening, amber light. The image vanished, leaving only the mundane parchment beneath. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between my throat and my chest. This was no longer just the product of a sleep-deprived imagination. Distinct, guttural sounds, low and resonant, like stones grinding together beneath the earth. Mine, they hissed, a dry, rasping breath that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. You are mine. The words clawed at the walls of my skull, not spoken aloud. A book, a heavy tome on regional geology, slid from its shelf in the library, landing with a jarring thud that vibrated through the floor. I spun, heart hammering against my ribs. There was no breeze, no tremor. The air in the room was still and stagnant, yet the book lay open on the carpet, its brittle pages splayed. I stared at it, then at the empty space on the shelf, a silent, gaping wound. I stumbled back to the desk, my hands fumbling for my mobile phone. I needed to speak to someone, anyone, to anchor myself to reality. I tried my cousin, a pragmatic accountant who would surely dismiss my fears with logical, if unhelpful, explanations. The phone rang once, twice, then died, the screen going black. I tried again. Nothing. The battery, I noted, was fully charged. I tried the landline, snatching up the receiver.
A dial tone, blessedly normal. I punched in the number.
The ringing sound was clear, unwavering. Then, just as I heard the click of an answering machine, a wave of frigid air swept through the room, raising gooseflesh on my arms.
I dropped it as if burned.
The single, incomplete line, the one I had been trying to verify, seemed to deepen, to glow with an inner fire. It no longer looked like a mere cartographic anomaly, but a vein, a conduit, leading to something unspeakable. But as I watched, my reflection flickered, distorting. My isolation was complete, the outside world a distant, unreachable shore. Whatever ancient horror slept beneath this land, it was awake now, and it had claimed me.
My
isolation, once a creeping shadow, had solidified into an impenetrable wall. My resolve, however, was a stubborn ember in the encroaching gloom.
I would not simply succumb. I would understand.
Days bled into nights within the estate's decaying library, the air thick with the scent of mildewed paper and forgotten dust.
My fingers, stained with ink and grime, traced the intricate, unsettling lines of the ancestral map.
I had exhausted every other avenue, every historical record, every fated deed. Only the map remained, a cryptic testament to something profoundly wrong. My gaze, raw and burning, drifted to the margins of the parchment, where a series of arcane symbols had always seemed like mere decorative flourishes. They were not merely decorative. They were a language, archaic and potent, a visual incantation. I pulled closer the family journal, its leather binding cracked like desiccated skin, its pages brittle as autumn leaves. I had dismissed the rambling entries of a distant forebear as the delusions of a mind unhinged by solitude. But a specific passage, scrawled in a hand that trembled even on the page, now snagged my attention: the great sleep. The earth's maw. The binding. My breath caught, a ragged gasp in the suffocating quiet. I cross-referenced the journal's crude sketches with the map's symbols. A pattern emerged, horrifying in its clarity. The lines on the map, which I had believed depicted subterranean waterways or geological faults, were something far more sinister. They were not natural formations but engineered pathways, converging upon a central point deep beneath the estate. And the symbols, when translated through the journal's fragmented cipher, spoke of containment, of a seal forged not to protect a treasure, but to imprison a primal force. The map did not lead to an ancient treasure, it led to an ancient prison. It was weakening. The language spoke of cracks forming in the binding, of a pressure building beneath the earth, seeking release. Then came the true, soul-shattering revelation. The journal detailed a lineage, my lineage, intertwined with the estate. It spoke of custodians, of those chosen by blood to maintain the seal, to keep the great sleep undisturbed. My arrival here, my inheritance, was no accident. I had been drawn, inevitably, by the weakening of the binding, by the entity's subtle, insidious call. I was either the last hope to complete the map, to reinforce the failing seal, or, more terrifyingly, the unwitting key to its final, devastating release. The truth descended upon me like a crushing weight, stealing the air from my lungs. I stumbled from the library, the flickering candlelight suddenly unbearable, the ancient walls of the estate closing in like a crypt. I needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating presence of this unearthed horror. I do not remember the drive, only the blurring landscape, the desperate need for distance. My car, a rattling shell of normalcy, seemed to carry me through a fog of unreality until, abruptly, the engine died with a final, shuddering cough. The vast, cavernous space stretched before me, an eerie monument to commerce, now silent and deserted. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile, incessant drone, bathing everything in an unblinking, pallid glow. Mannequins, frozen in their fashion poses, stood like silent, judging sentinels behind plate glass windows. The air, recycled and odorless, offered no solace, no escape from the suffocating truth I carried. Here, amidst the empty storefronts and the ghostly reflections, the revelation gnawed at me with renewed ferocity. I traced the ghost of the map's lines on the condensation of a shop window, seeing the converging points, the failing seal, the horror stirring beneath. And I, Reid, cartographer of the known, had stumbled upon the cartography of the unspeakable. The entity was weakening, and I was inextricably bound to its awakening. The outside world was not a distant shore, it was merely another room in the entity's expanding prison, and I was already inside. A strange, insistent current had begun to pull at me, a low hum beneath the thrum of my own frantic pulse. It was a sensation not unlike the magnetic north on a compass, but twisted, malignant, drawing me away from the decaying manor, away from the familiar, terrifying confines of my inheritance. The polished floors gleamed with an unsettling sheen, reflecting the relentless glow of fluorescent tubes that hummed overhead like a million trapped insects. The air was cool, sterile, carrying faint ghost scents of forgotten perfumes and stale popcorn. Storefronts, their gates drawn, stared out with blank, unblinking eyes, displaying mannequins frozen in silent, unnatural poses. The compulsion grew, a tightening band around my skull, guiding me past the silent kiosks and the vacant food court, towards the central atrium. As I neared, the shimmering intensified, distorting the pristine white walls and the polished chrome railings. A low thrum began in my chest, not my heart, but something deeper, resonant, vibrating through my bones. Then, it began. Not a sound, but an overwhelming pressure that slammed into my mind, a torrent of alien sensation. It was a hunger, vast and ancient, a craving for existence, for form, for the very essence of my living self. Images flashed, not seen with my eyes. Yield. The thought was not my own, yet it bloomed in my mind with an insidious familiarity, like a forgotten memory dredged from the deepest well. Surrender your claim. Become the vessel. I clutched at my head, the pressure building, threatening to split my skull. My vision blurred, the bright lights of the mall warping into elongated streaks of agony. The entity was not merely stirring, it was here, now, in this incongruous, brightly lit tomb, attempting to weave itself into the very fabric of my being. Just as the edges of my awareness began to fray, just as I felt my will buckling under the relentless assault, a new image burst forth, unbidden, from the depths of my memory. A page, torn and brittle, from one of the estate's forgotten journals, one I had dismissed as mere ancestral ramblings. Words, now searingly clear, etched themselves into my mind, a desperate countermeasure, a forgotten ritual. It spoke of a severing, a profound renunciation. To reseal the entity, to drive it back into the earth from whence it came, required more than just symbols or incantations. It demanded the complete and utter unmaking of the connection between the land, the bloodline, and the map. The map, the very object of my obsession, was not merely a guide, it was a conduit. It would mean erasing my future, dissolving my past, becoming a blank slate upon which nothing of my ancestral history remained. This was not just about the estate, or my sanity. If the entity fully awakened, if it consumed me and broke free, it would not merely corrupt the land, it would spread, a creeping blight of ancient malevolence, feeding on the very concept of belonging, of inheritance, of history itself.
It would unravel the world, thread by horrifying thread. Yield. Inherit.
The horror was immense, the sacrifice daunting, but the alternative was unthinkable.
I would not become.
I would fight, even if it meant becoming nobody. Even if it meant shattering the very foundation of who I was, I would seal this thing. The fate of the land, and perhaps far more, rested on my shattered will. I would find a way to complete this terrifying, final act. I clutched at my head, the pressure building, threatening to split my skull, not with pain, but with the sheer weight of unbearable knowledge. I was falling, not physically, but internally, into a bottomless chasm of pure, unadulterated dread.
I was alone, truly alone, amidst the ghostly mannequins and the shrouded kiosks, a forgotten relic in a mausoleum of commerce.
But the fall, the plummet into madness, had been interrupted, not by a soft landing, but by a sudden, jarring clarity. It was as if 1,000 fragmented thoughts, each a shard of glass, had suddenly clicked into a horrifying mosaic.
The map. The estate. A ritual. A sacrifice. My sacrifice, perhaps. The drive back was a blur of highway lights and the incessant drumming of rain against the windshield. The gate, once a barrier of stubborn iron, now seemed to swing open willingly, a maw inviting me inward. The air here was different, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a metallic tang, like old blood, clinging to the very fibers of the atmosphere. The map, my constant companion, felt impossibly heavy in my trembling hands as I navigated the familiar, yet suddenly alien, paths. The descent began not in the main house, but at the edge of the overgrown formal gardens, where a forgotten chamber lay hidden beneath a collapsed gazebo. I had discovered its entrance weeks ago, a rough-hewn stone door obscured by generations of ivy, but had never dared to venture beyond its threshold. Tonight, there was no hesitation, only a grim resolve. I stepped into the black, the stone door clanging shut behind me with a sound that reverberated through the very earth, sealing my fate. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rough-hewn steps descending into the earth. With each step, the pressure in my skull returned, a dull ache that throbbed in rhythm with an unseen pulse. They were insidious, slithering suggestions, memories of past failures, of forgotten fears. Turn back, Reid. You are not strong enough. This is not your burden. My own voice, my father's, a colleague's, all warped into a chorus of doubt. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, pressing my palms against my temples. The air grew heavier, thick and cloying, making each breath a laborious effort. Then the illusions intensified. A warm, inviting hearth glowed in the distance, promising peace. I pushed through the phantom figures, their smiles twisting into grimaces of disappointment as I ignored their silent pleas. A sudden tremor shook the ground, dislodging a cascade of loose earth and small stones from the ceiling, showering me in grit. I stumbled, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the crumbling walls. The entity was actively resisting, I realized, not just with mental torment, but with physical obstacles. A sharp, jagged protrusion of rock seemed to jut out from the wall where there had been none before, tearing at my sleeve as I squeezed past. Further down, the steps vanished, replaced by a treacherous slope of loose scree. My foot slipped, and I plunged forward, scraping my hands raw against the unyielding stone before catching myself. A low, guttural moan echoed from the depths, a sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but within the very bones of my chest. It was a sound of immense, ancient hunger. My map, clutched in my bleeding hand, felt alive, its parchment warm, vibrating faintly. It guided me, not with lines and symbols, but with an internal compass, an undeniable pull towards the deepest corruption. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous space, the air here thick with an almost palpable malevolence. And then, in the center of the chamber, the beam found it. A pedestal, not carved by human hands, but a natural formation of jagged, black rock, its surface stained with an ancient, rust-colored patina. Upon it, a shallow basin, perfectly circular, seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, like a dying ember. This was it. The altar. The focus. The place of the desperate ritual. A wave of despair, profound and absolute, washed over me, threatening to drown my will. You cannot do this, Reid. It will consume you. The temptation was overwhelming, to turn, to flee, to embrace oblivion rather than this terrifying act. There was no turning back. I had descended too far. My hand, still clutching the map, reached out, trembling, towards the basin, ready to fulfill the entity's terrible demand. The grand, sunlit hall, shimmering with phantom faces, dissolved not into darkness, but into a blinding, artificial brilliance. My eyes recoiled, stinging, as the air, once thick and cloying, became unnaturally dry, smelling of stale popcorn and disinfectant. I stumbled forward, my boot heels clicking with a hollow resonance that echoed through the vast, silent expanse. This was not the passage. This was not the earth. Fluorescent tubes hummed relentlessly above, bathing everything in a sterile, indifferent glow. Empty storefronts, their gates drawn, stared like vacant eyes. A lone, silent escalator ascended to an unseen floor, its metal teeth gleaming under the harsh light. My mind reeled, a compass spinning wildly in a magnetic storm. This was a trick, a cruel, elaborate illusion woven by the entity, a final, desperate attempt to shatter my resolve. It sought to drown me in the mundane, the sterile, to make the ancient horror seem ludicrous in this temple of modern commerce. But the map, clutched in my trembling hand, still felt real, its parchment rough against my palm, its ink an anchor in this sea of fabricated reality. I closed my eyes, forcing the image of the mall away, and saw the map instead. The intricate lines, the ancient symbols, the hidden geometries of the estate. It was all there, a blueprint not just of land, but of power, of containment. And within its final, incomplete quadrant, a pattern had emerged, a weakness, a ritual of binding. It was a cartographic key, a method to anchor the chaotic to a fixed point, to impose order upon the formless. It sought to disorient, to drive me to my knees, to make me believe this brightly lit prison was my true reality. The mannequins seemed to stir in my peripheral vision, their blank stares following my every move. You will not break me here. I opened my eyes, scanning the vast, empty space. The map's final sigil required a central point, a place of convergence, and 4 cardinal anchors. I saw it now, not with my eyes, but with the cartographer's instinct. The mall's central atrium, beneath the enormous skylight, was the heart. The 4 main corridors leading off it, the anchors. The entity had chosen this space for its familiarity, its perceived safety, but in doing so, it had inadvertently provided the very structure I needed. I moved, a solitary figure in the artificial dawn. My steps echoed, each one a defiant declaration. I pulled a piece of charred charcoal from my satchel, a fragment from the estate's hearth, imbued with the earth's memory. This would be my ink. My compass, still true despite the entity's machinations, would be my guide. At the atrium's center, beneath the unseen skylight, I knelt. The polished floor gleamed. I began to draw, using the charcoal to etch the map's final, intricate sigil onto the floor. It was a complex mandala of lines and angles, of ancient symbols I had painstakingly deciphered from the map's margins. Each stroke was an act of will, a defiance against the rising tide of fear. The entity raged, not with sound, but with pressure, a crushing weight on my chest, a prickling sensation on my skin as if invisible tendrils sought to burrow into my flesh. I am the earth, the root, the hunger beneath all things. My hand trembled, but I pressed on. The ritual demanded precision, absolute focus. I drew the central node, a swirling vortex of protective glyphs, then extended the lines towards the 4 cardinal points. As I completed each segment, a faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the floor. The entity fought back, not with physical force, but with psychological warfare. Visions flickered across the empty storefronts, my own face, contorted in agony, then the faces of those I had loved, screaming, their eyes black pits of despair. I gritted my teeth, forcing the images away, chanting the forgotten words I had found inscribed on the map's reverse, words of binding and severance. The charcoal dust clung to my fingers, blackening them, becoming a part of me. The event was the completion of the ritual. The map had not merely shown me how to contain it, it had revealed that the cost of its containment was a severance of the very thread that connected me to my past, to the earth itself. To cage it, I had to sever that connection, becoming an outsider to my own history. A final, ear-splitting shriek, not of sound but of pure psychic agony, tore through them all. The lights flickered violently, then steadied. The pressure vanished, leaving behind an echoing emptiness. The mannequins stood motionless again, their smiles once more benignly vacant. The silent escalator continued its endless ascent. The ritual was complete. The entity was contained, banished, perhaps even bound to the very patterns I had drawn. The mall, in its artificial perfection, now felt utterly devoid of its presence. But the cost. The victory was ashes in my mouth. I felt lighter, yes, unbound, but also utterly adrift. The deep, grounding connection I had always felt to the land, to the ancient stones of the estate, was gone. My cartographer's eye, once so keen for the hidden contours of the earth, now saw only flat surfaces, disconnected lines. The world felt thin, translucent, as if I no longer truly belonged to it. I had saved the land, perhaps, but I had lost myself in the process, a ghost in my own skin, forever separated from the very essence I had sought to understand and protect. The hum intensified, a low thrum that vibrated not just the floorboards beneath my knees, but the very bones within my body. It rose from an imperceptible whisper to a resonant growl, a sound I felt more than heard, a frequency that seemed to unravel the fabric of the air itself. The glyphs I'd meticulously drawn on the ancient wood pulsed with a faint, internal light, a cold, phosphorescent glow that flickered with the rhythm of the thrumming. My vision blurred at the edges, the world tilting, and then, with a final, shuddering surge that tore through me like a physical blow, the sound ceased. Abruptly. Completely. Silence descended. The taste of dust and copper filled my mouth. Pain, a dull, pervasive ache, settled deep in my muscles, radiating from 100 tiny fissures in my exhausted form. My left arm, I realized, was twisted at an unnatural angle, a sharp, searing agony lancing through me with every shallow breath. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like earth disturbed from a millennia-long sleep. When I finally forced my eyes open, the estate was a husk. The walls, already crumbling, had fractured further, great fissures snaking across the plaster like spiderwebs. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced through the shattered windows, illuminating the debris, the splintered furniture, the very wreckage of my ancestral home. It was gone. And in its wake, only desolation. The next thing I truly recall is the stark, artificial glare of 1,000 fluorescent tubes. It hummed with the ghosts of commerce, with the lingering scent of synthetic vanilla and stale popcorn. My head pounded, a persistent drumbeat behind my eyes. I sat slumped against the cool, polished marble of a display counter, its glass empty, its signage proclaiming seasonal savings in cheerful, primary colors. My skin was a tapestry of abrasions and cuts, some shallow, others deeper, etched with a raw, angry red. The most prominent, a jagged scar, ran from my left temple, across my cheekbone, and down to my jaw, a fresh, fiery testament to a struggle I could barely piece together. My left arm hung uselessly, a constant throb reminding me of its broken state. Each breath was a shallow, careful act, my ribs protesting with every expansion. The mall was a labyrinth of deserted storefronts, their gates pulled down, their interiors visible only as vague shapes through the grates. Their immaculate, unblemished forms seemed to mock my own ruined state. I pushed myself up, a groan escaping my lips. My legs felt like unfamiliar stilts, each step a precarious wobble. The polished floor reflected my gaunt, wild-eyed face, a stranger's face, etched with a horror that felt too vast, too personal, to ever truly fade. I saw the tremor in my hands, the constant, almost imperceptible shake that had become my new companion. A large, digital clock high above the central atrium glowed with an indifferent red, 3:17. The time meant nothing. The day, the week, the month, they were all indistinct blurs. The world outside, the world of people and schedules and mundane concerns, felt impossibly distant, a fragile illusion I could no longer inhabit. A sudden, sharp pain flared in my head, a flash of insight, a fragment of memory that wasn't quite mine. The hum, the vibration that had coursed through me, had left more than just physical damage. It had left an echo, a resonance. The mall's emptiness pressed in, a silent witness to a trauma it could not comprehend. I was adrift, a survivor of a war no one else knew had been fought, carrying the scars of a victory that felt indistinguishable from defeat. The hum, though no longer a physical tremor in the soles of my feet or the marrow of my bones, had transmuted into a phantom echo within the chambers of my skull. It was a resonance that followed me, a low, persistent thrum beneath the surface of all other sounds, a constant reminder of the price exacted. I walked now with a different gait, each step a conscious effort to reclaim the ground beneath me, to assert my presence against the memory of something vast and ancient that had almost consumed it. The fluorescent glow, an indifferent, sterile brilliance, spilled over polished floors and silent storefronts. My footsteps, usually muted by the daytime din, now echoed with a stark clarity, each one a lonely punctuation mark in the vast, empty space. The air, cool and recycled, carried the ghost of perfumed samples and processed food, a synthetic bouquet that felt utterly alien after the damp earth and decaying wood of the estate. Mundane anchors in a world that had, for a time, tilted precariously off its axis. The mannequins, frozen in their perfect, vacant poses, seemed to watch me from behind glass, their painted smiles stretched into unsettling rictus grins. I found myself avoiding their gazes, a ridiculous, childish impulse, yet one I could not shake. The silence here was not the profound, ancient quiet of the estate, heavy with unspoken histories. This was a superficial silence, a holding breath before the next day's clamor, and it felt more unsettling, more hollow, precisely because it was so devoid of natural life. The faint, tinny strains of an elevator's ascent, or the distant clang of a cleaning cart, would send a jolt through me, a primal flinch that betrayed the frayed edges of my composure. The ordinary act was meant to ground me, to tether me to the familiar, but the sensation merely amplified the strange disconnect I felt. The estate, I knew, was quiet now. The ground had settled. The low thrumming had ceased, or at least, receded beyond the threshold of ordinary hearing. I had done what needed to be done. But the peace was a fragile thing, built upon a foundation of unspeakable knowledge. My face was thinner, etched with lines that hadn't been there before. The entity had not been defeated, not truly. It had merely been contained. I had become its guardian. The knowledge of its presence, the map of its buried influence, was now etched into my mind as deeply as the glyphs had been into the earth. The hum, that phantom echo, was not just a memory, it was a tether. I was bound to it, not by chains, but by a terrible, intimate understanding. The sacrifice I had made, the unspeakable act that had quieted the land, had also forged an unbreakable link. My victory was not freedom, but a life sentence as the keeper of a terrible secret, the unwitting sentinel of an ancient, slumbering horror. I stopped in the deserted food court, the plastic tables and chairs arranged in neat, silent rows. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I could feel the earth beneath the polished tiles, the deep, silent pulse that still resonated, not from the estate miles away, but from the very ground I stood upon. The pens, the gloves, the mundane anchors, they felt like flimsy illusions now. My new beginning was not one of release, but of eternal watchfulness. The horror was contained, yes, but it lived within me, a silent, demanding passenger. I was no longer just Reid, the cartographer.